great sage was a tall, untidy man, bearded but bald. His library resembled him. All the books had been moved over the years to the bottom shelves where they gathered in dusty conglomerations. He used several of the books in his current lecture, explaining to his students, Texim and Vonguldak, how the Mages Guild had first been founded by Venus Galarian. They had many questions about Galarian's beginnings in the Sigic Order and how the study of magic there differed from the Mages Guild. It was, and is, a very structured way of life, explained the great sage. Quite elitist, actually. That was the aspect of its Galarian most objected to. He wanted the study of the magic to be free. Well, not free exactly, but at least available to all who could afford it. In doing that, he changed the course of life in Tamriel. He codified the practices and rituals used by all modern potion makers, item makers, and spell makers, didn't he, great sage? Asked Vonguldak. That was only part of it. Magic as we know it today comes from Venus Galarian. He restructured the schools to be understandable by the masses. He invented the tools of alchemy and enchanting so that everyone could concoct whatever they wanted, whatever their skills and purse would allow them to, without fears of magical backfire. Well, eventually he created that. What do you mean, great sage? Asked Taxum. The first tools were more automated than the ones we have today. Any layman could use them without the least understanding of enchantment and alchemy. On the Isle of Archim, the students had to learn the skills laboriously and over many years, but Galarian decided that was another example of the Sigic's elitism. The tools he invented were like robotic master enchanters and alchemists capable of creating anything the customer required, provided he could pay. So someone could, for example, create a sword that would cleave the world in twain? Asked Vonguldak. I suppose in theory, but it would probably take all the gold in the world, chuckled the great sage. He chuckles darkly. No, I can't say we were ever in very great danger, but that it isn't to say that there weren't a few unfortunate incidents where an unschooled yokel invented something beyond his ken. Eventually, of course, Galarian tore apart his old tools and created what we use today. It's a little elitist, requiring that people know what they're doing before they do it, but remarkably practical. What did people invent? Asked Taxum. Are there any stories? You're trying to distract me so I don't test you, said the great sage. But I suppose I can tell you one story, just to illustrate a point. This particular tale takes place in city of Alinor on the west coast of Somerset Isle and concerns a scribe named Thorbad. This was in the Second Era, not long after Venus Galarian had first founded the Mages Guild, and chapter houses had sprung up all over Somerset, though not yet spread to the mainland of Tamriel. For 5 years, his scribe, Thorbad, had conducted all his correspondence to the outside world by way of his messenger boy, Gorgus, for the first year of his adoption of the hermit life. His few remaining friends and family of his dead wife, truth be told, had tried visiting, but even the most indefatigable kin gives up eventually when given no encouragement. No one had good reason to keep in touch with Thorbad Holzig, and in time very few ever tried. They have 5 billion fantasy names! Every word is a fantasy name! His sister-in-law sent him the occasional letter with news of people he could barely remember, but even that communication was rare. Most of messages to and from his house dealt with his business, writing the weekly proclamation for the Temple of Oriel. These were bulletins nailed in the temple door, community news, sermons, that sort of thing. The first message Gorgus brought him that day was from his healer, reminding him of his appointment in Turdas. Thorbad took a while to write his response, glum and affirmative. He had the Crimson Plague, which he was being treated for at considerable expense. You have to remember these were the days before the School of Restoration had become quite so specialized. It was a dreadful disease and had taken away his voice box. That was why he only communicated by script. The next message was from Alfiers, the secretary of the church, as curt and noxious as ever. Thorbad, attached is Sundas's sermon. Next week's event calendar and the obituaries, try to liven them up a little. I wasn't happy with your last attempt. Thorbad had taken the job putting together in bulletin before Alfiers joined the temple, so his only mental image of her was purely theoretical and had evolved over time. At first he thought of Alfiers as an ugly fat floatus covered with warts. More recently she had mutated into a rail-thin spinster orcus. Of course it was possible his clairvoyance was accurate and she had just lost weight. Whatever Alfiers looked like, her attitude towards Thorbad was clear, unwavering disdain. She hated his sense of humor, always found the most minor of misspellings, and considered his structure and calligraphy the worst kind of amateur work. Luckily, working for a temple was the next most secure job to working for the good king of Alinor. It didn't bring in very much money, but his expenses were minimal. The truth was, he didn't need to do it anymore. He had quite a fortune stashed away, but he didn't have anything else to occupy his days. And the truth was further that having little else to occupy his time and thoughts, the bulletin was very important to him. Gorgus, having delivered all the messages, began to clean, and as he did so, he told Thorbad all the news in town. The boy always did so, and Thorbad seldom paid him any attention, but this time he had an interesting report. The Mages Guild had come to Alinor. As Thorbad listened intently, Gorgus told him all about the guild, the remarkable Archmagister, and the incredible tools of alchemy and enchanting. Finally, when the lad had finished, Thorbad scribbled a quick note and handed it and a quill to Gorgas. The note read, "Have them enchant this quill. It will be expensive," said Gorgas. Thorbat gave Gorgas a sizable chunk of the thousands of gold pieces he had saved over the years and sent him out the door. Now Thorbat decided he would finally have the ability to impress Alfiers and bring glory to the Temple of Auriel. The way I've heard the story, Gorgas had thought about taking the gold and leaving Eleanor, but he had come to care for poor old Thorbat, and even more, he hated Alfiers, who had to see every day to get his messages for his master. It wasn't perhaps for the best of motivations, but Gorgas decided to go to the guild and get the quill enchanted. The Mages Guild was not then, especially not then, an elitist institution, as I have said, but when the messenger boy came in and asked to use the item maker, he was greeted with some suspicion. When he showed the bag of gold, the attitude melted, and he was ushered in the room. Now, I haven't seen one of the enchanting tools of old, so you must use your imagination. There was a large prism for the item to be bound with magicka, assuredly, and an assortment of soul gems and globes of trapped energies. Other than that, I cannot be certain how it looked or how it worked. Because of all the gold he gave to the guild, Gorgas could infuse a quill with the highest priced soul available, which was something Diedrich called Feyfolken. The initiate at the guild, being ignorant as most guild members were at the time, did not know very much about the spirit except that it was filled with energy. When Gorgas left the room, the quill had been enchanted to its very limit, and then some. It was virtually quivering with power. Of course, when Thorbat used it, that's when it became clear how over his head he was. "And now," said the great sage, "it's time for your test." "But what happened? What were the quill's powers?" cried Taxum. "You can't stop the tale there," objected Volgoldak. "We will continue the tale after your conjuration test, provided you both perform exceptionally well," said the great sage. So that's why we have to read Feyfolken 2! After the test had been given, and Volgoldak and Taxum had demonstrated their knowledge of elementary conjuration, the great sage told them that they were free to enjoy the day. The two lads, who most afternoons fidgeted through their lessons, refused to leave their seats. "You told us that after the test, you'd tell us more of your tale about the scribe and his enchanted quill," said Taxum. "And the Grems. You've already told us about the scribe, how he lived alone in his battles with the temple secretary over the bulletin he scripted for posting, and how he suffered from the Crimson Plague and couldn't speak. When you left off, his messenger boy had just had his master's quill enchanted with the spirit of a daedra named Feyfolken," added Volgoldak to add the great sage's memory. "As it happens," said the great sage, "I was thinking about a nap. However, the story does touch on some issues of the natures of spirits and thus is related to conjuration, so I'll continue." Thorbat began using the quill to write the temple bulletin, and there was something about the slightly lopsided, almost three-dimensional quality of the letters that Thorbat liked a lot. Into the night, Thorbat put together the Temple of Auriel's bulletin. For the moment he washed over the page with the Feyfolken quill, it became a work of art, an illuminated manuscript crafted of gold, but with good, simple, and strong vernacular. The sentiment excerpts read like poetry, despite being based on an archpriest workman-like exhortation of the most banal of the Elysian doctrines. The obituaries of two of the temple's chief benefactors were stark and powerful, pitifully mundane deaths transitioned into world-class tragedies. Thorbat worked the magical palette until he nearly fainted from exhaustion. At 6 o'clock in the morning, as day before deadline, he handed the bulletin to Gorgas for him to carry to Alfiers, the temple secretary. As expected, Alfiers never wrote back to compliment him, or even comment on how early he had sent the bulletin. It didn't matter. Thorbat knew it was the best bulletin the temple had ever posted. At 1 o'clock on Sundas, Gorgas brought him many messages. "The bulletin today was so beautiful when I read it in the vestibule. I'm ashamed to tell you I wept copiously," wrote the archpriest. "I don't think I've seen anything that captures Auriel's glory so beautifully before. The cathedrals of first hold pale in comparison. My friend, I prostrate to myself before the greatest artist since Galileo." The archpriest was, like most men of the cloth, given to hyperbole. Still, Thorbat was happy with the compliment. More messages followed. All of the temple elders and 33 of the parishioners, young and old, had all taken the time to find out who wrote the bulletin and how to get a message to congratulate him. And there was only one person they could go through for that information: Alfiers. Imaging the dragon lady besieged by his admirers filled Thorbat with positive glee. He was still in a good mood the next day when he took the ferry to his appointment with his healer Telemishiel. The herbalist was new, a pretty red guard woman who tried to talk to him even after he gave her the note reading, "My name is Thorbat Holzik, and I have an appointment with Telemishiel for 11 o'clock. Please forgive me for not talking, but I have no voice box anymore." "Has it started raining yet?" she asked cheerfully. The diviner said it might. Thorbat frowned and shook his head angrily. Why was it that everyone thought that mute people liked to be talked to? Did soldiers who lost their arms like to be thrown balls? It was undoubtedly not a purposefully cruel behavior, but Thorbat still suspected that some people just like to prove that they weren't crippled too. The examination itself was routine horror. Telemishiel performed the regular invasive torture, all the while chatting and chatting and chatting. "You ought to try talking once in a while. That's the only way to see if you're getting better. If you don't feel comfortable doing it in public, you could try practicing it by yourself," said Telemishiel, knowing his patient would ignore his advice. "Try singing in the bath. You'll probably find you don't sound as bad as you think." Thorbat left the examination with the promise of test results in a couple of weeks. On the ferry ride back home, Thorbat began thinking of next week's temple bulletin. What about a double border around the last Sundas's offering plate announcement? Putting the sermon in 2 columns instead of 1 might have interesting effects. It was almost unbearable to think that he couldn't get started on it until Aviel sent him information. But she did. It was with the note, Last bulletin a little better. Next time don't use the word fortuitous in place of fortunate. The words are not, if you look them up, synonymous. In response, Thorbad almost followed Teleminstrel's advice by screaming obscenities at Gorgas. Instead, he drank a bottle of cheap wine, composed and sent a suitable reply, and fell asleep on the floor. The next morning, after a long bath, Thorbad began work on the bulletin. His idea for putting a light shading effect on the special announcements section had an amazing textural effect. Alfears always hated the extra decorations he added to the borders, but using the Feyfolken quill, they look strangely powerful and majestic. Gorgas came to him with a message from Alfears at that very moment, as if in response. To the thought, Thorbad opened it up. It simply said, "I'm sorry." Thorbad kept working. Alfear's note he put from his mind, sure that she would soon follow it up with the complete message. "I'm sorry that no one ever taught you to keep right hand and left hand margins the same length," or "I'm sorry we can't get someone other than a weird old man as a scribe for our bulletin." It didn't matter what she was sorry about. The columns from the sermon notes rose like the massive pillars of roses crowned with unashamedly ornate headers. The obituaries and birth announcements were framed together with a spherical border as a heartbreaking declaration of the circle of life. The bulletin was simultaneously both warm and avant-garde. It was a masterpiece. When he sent it off to Alfears late that afternoon, he knew she'd hate it and was glad. Thorbad was surprised to get a message from the temple on Loridas. Before he read the content, he could tell from the style that it wasn't from Alfears. The handwriting wasn't Alfears' usual belligerent, flashing style. And it wasn't all in Alfears' usual capital letters, which read like a scream from Oblivion. Oblivion! What happened? What happened to Alfears? Thorbad, I thought you should know. Alfears isn't at the temple anymore. She quit her position yesterday, very suddenly. My name is Vanderthil, and I was lucky enough, let me admit it now, I beg pitifully, to be your new temple contact. I'm overwhelmed by your genius. I was having a crisis of faith until I read last week's bulletin. This week's bulletin is a miracle. Enough I just wanted to say I'm honored to be working with you. Vanderthil. What happened to Alfears? What if they became friends? No! The response on Sundas after the service even astonished Thorbad. The archpriest attributed the massive increase in attendance and collection plate offerings entirely to the bulletin. Thorbad's salary was quadrupled. Gorgas brought over 120 messages from his adoring public. The following week, Thorbad sat in front of his writing plank, a glass of fine Torvali mead at his side. Staring at the blank scroll, he had no ideas. The bulletin his child, his second wife, bored him. The third-rate sermons of the archbishop were absolute anathema, and the deaths and births of the temple patron struck him as entirely pointless. Blah, blah, he thought as he scribbled on the page. He knew he wrote the letters blah, BLA, BLA. The words that appeared on the scroll were, "A necklace of pearl on a white neck." He scrawled a jagged line across the page. It appeared in through that damned beautiful Feyfolken quill. Glory to Oriel. Thorbad slammed the quill in poetry, spilled forth in a stream of ink. He scratched over the page, blotting over everything, and the vanquished words sprung back up in different form, even more exquisite than before. Every daub and splatter caused the document to whirl like a kaleidoscope before falling together in gorgeous asymmetry. There was nothing he could do to ruin the bulletin. Feyfolken had taken over. He was a reader, not an author. Now, asked the great sage, what was Feyfolken from your knowledge of the School of Conjuration? What happened next? Cried Volgodak. First, tell me what Feyfolken was, and then I'll continue the story. You said it was a Daedra, said Taxim, and it seems to have something to do with artistic expression. Was Feyfolken a servitor of Azra? But the scribe may have been imagining all this, said Volgodak. Perhaps Feyfolken is a servitor of Shiogorath, and he's gone mad, or the quill's writing makes everyone who views it, like all the congregation at the Temple of Oriel, go mad. Hermias Moore is a Daedra of knowledge, and her scene is a Daedra of the wild. The Daedra of revenge is Boethia. Pondered Taxim and then smiled. Feyfolken the servitor of Clavicus Vile, isn't it? Very good, said the great sage. How did he know? It's his style, said Taxim. Assuming that he doesn't want the power of the quill now that he has it, what happens next? I'll tell you, said the great sage, and continued the tale. You're going to forget everything about the story in like an hour? No! Write it down! Commit it to memory! You have to remember about the Feyfolken. Thorbad had at last seen the power of the quill, said the great sage, continuing his tale. Enchanted with the Daedra Feyfolken, servitor of Clavicus Vile, it had brought him great wealth and fame as described in the weekly bulletin in the Temple of Ariel, but he realized that it was the artist and he merely the witness to its magic. He was furious and jealous. With a cry, he snapped the quill in half. He turned to finish his glass of mead. When he turned around, the quill was intact. He had no other quills but the one he had enchanted, so he dipped his finger in the inkwell and wrote a note to Gorgas in big, sloppy letters. When Gorgas returned with a new batch of congratulatory messages from the temple praising his latest bulletin, he handed the note and the quill to the messenger boy. The note read, "Take the quill back to the Mage's Guild and sell it. Find me another quill with no enchantments." Gorgas didn't know what to make of the note, but he did as he was told. He returned a few hours later. "They wouldn't give us any gold back for it," said Gorgas. "They said it wasn't enchanted." I told him, I said, What are you talking about? You enchanted it right here with that Feyfolken soul gem. And they said, well, there ain't a soul in it now. Maybe you did something and it got loose. Gorgas paused to look at his master. Thorbat couldn't speak, of course, but he seemed even more than usually speechless. Anyway, I threw the quill away and got you this new one, like you said. Thorbat studied the new quill. It was white-feathered while his old quill had been dove gray. It felt good in his hand. He sighed with relief and waved his messenger lad away. He had a bulletin to write, and this time without any magic except for his own talent. Within 2 days' time, he was nearly back on schedule. It looked plain, but it was entirely his. Thorbat felt a strange reassurance when he ran his eyes over the page and noticed some slight errors. It had been a long time since the bulletin contained any errors, in fact. Thorbat reflected happily. There were probably other mistakes still in the document that he was not seeing. He was finishing a final whirl of plain calligraphy on the borders when Gorgas arrived with some messages from the temple. He looked through them all quickly until one caught his eye. The wax seal on the letter read, Feyfolken. With complete bafflement, he broke it open. I think you should kill yourself. It read in a perfectly gorgeous script. Who's sending him hater messages? When you get letters in the mail, you should kill yourself now. I think your writing sucks and you should kill yourself. He dropped the letter to the floor, seeing sudden movement on the bulletin. Feyfolken's script leapt from the letter and coursed over the scroll in a flood, translating his shabby document into a work of sublime beauty. Thorbat no longer cared about the weird croaking quality of his voice. He screamed for a very long time and then drank heavily. Gorgas brought Thorbat a message from Vanderthil, the secretary of the temple. Early for this morning, but it took the scribe until mid-morning to work up the courage to look at it. Good morning. I am just checking in on the bulletin. You usually have it in on this night. I'm curious. You planning something special? Vanderthil. Thorbat responded, Vanderthil, I'm sorry, I've been sick. There won't be a bulletin in this Sunday. And handed the note to Gorgas before retiring to his bath. When he came back an hour later, Gorgas was just returning from the temple, smiling. Vanderthil and the archpriest went crazy, he said. They said it was your best work ever. Thorbat looked at Gorgas uncomprehending. Then he noticed that the bulletin was gone. Shaking, he dipped his finger in the inkwell and scrawled the words. What did the note I sent with you say? You don't remember? Asked Gorgas, holding back a smile. He knew the master had been drinking a lot lately. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, Vanderthil, here it is. Sorry it's late. I've been having severe mental problems lately. Thorbat. Since you said here it is, I figured you wanted me to bring the bulletin along, so I did. And like I said, they loved it. I bet you get 3 times as much letters this Sunday. Thorbat nodded his head, smiled, and waved the messenger lad away. Gorgas returned back to the temple while his master turned to his writing plank and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. He wrote with the quill. What do you want, Feyfolken? The words became, Goodbye, I hate my life, I have cut my wrist. Thorbat tried another tact. Have I gone insane? The words became, Goodbye, I have poison, I hate my life. What's happening? Why are you doing this to me? I, Thorbat Holzik, cannot live with myself in my ingratitude. That's why I put this noose around my neck. Thorbat picked up a fresh parchment, dipped his finger in the inkwell, and proceeded to rewrite the entire bulletin, while his original draft before Feyfolken had altered it had been simple and flawed. The new copy was a scrawl. Lowercase I's were undotted, G's looked like Y's, sentences ran into margins and curled up all over like serpents. Ink from the first page leaked into the second page. When he yanked the pages of the notebook, a long tear nearly divided the third page in half. Something about the final result was evocative. Thorbat at least hoped so. He wrote another note reading simply, Use this bulletin instead of the piece of trash I sent you. When Gorgas returned with new messages, Thorbat handed the envelope to him. The new letters were all the same, except for one from his healer, Televisial. Thorbat, we need you to come in as soon as possible. We've received a report from Black Marsh about a strain of the Crimson Plague that sounds very much like your disease, and we need to re-examine you. Nothing is definite yet, but we're going to want to see what our options are. It took Thorbat the rest of the day and 15 drams of the stoutest mead to recover. The larger part of the next morning was spent recovering from this means of recovery. He started to write a message to Vanderthil. What did you think of the new bulletin with the quill? Feyfolken's approved version was, I'm going to ignite myself on fire because I'm a dying no talent. Thorbat rewrote the note using his finger and ink message. When Gorgas appeared, he handed him the note. There was one message in Vanderthil's handwriting. It read, Thorbat, not only are you divinely inspired, but you have a great sense of humor. Imagine us using those scribbles you sent instead of the real bulletin. You made the Archbishop laugh heartily. I cannot wait to see what you have next week. Yours fondly, Vanderthil. The funeral service a week later brought out far more friends and admirers than Thorbat Holzik would have believed possible. The coffin, of course, had to be closed, but that didn't stop the mourners from filing into lines to touch its smooth oak surface, imagining it as the flesh of the artist himself. The Archbishop managed to rise to the occasion and deliver a better-than-usual eulogy. Thorbat's old nemesis, the secretary before Vanderthil, Alfiers, came in from cloud rest, wailing and telling all who would listen that Thorbat's suggestions had changed the direction of her life. When she had heard Thorbat had left his quill in his final testament, she broke down in tears. Did he do it on purpose? He's like, damn her. I hold a grudge to this day. Vanderthil was even more inconsolable until she found a handsome and delightfully single young man. I can hardly believe he's gone, and I never even saw him face to face or spoke to him, she said. I saw the body, but even if he hadn't been all burned up, I wouldn't have been able to tell if it was him or not. I wish I could tell you there'd been a mistake, but there was plenty of medical evidence, said Telemichiel. I supplied some of it myself. He was a patient of mine, you see. Oh, said Vanderthil. Was he sick or something? He had the Crimson Plague years ago. That's what took away his voice box, but it appeared to have gone into complete remission. Actually, I just sent him a note telling him words to that effect the day before he killed himself. You're that healer, exclaimed Vanderthil. Thorbad's messenger boy, Gorgus, told me that he had just picked up that message when I sent mine, complimenting him on the new primitive design for the bulletin. It was amazing work. I never would have told him this, but I had begun to suspect he was stuck in an outmoded style. It turned out he had one last work of genius before going out in a blaze of glory, figuratively and literally. Vanderthil showed the healer Thorbad's last bulletin, and Telemichiel agreed that its fantastic, nearly illegible style spoke volumes about the power and majesty of the god Auriel. Now I'm thoroughly confused, said Vungeldak. About which part? Asked the great sage. I think the tale is very straightforward. Feyfolken made all the bulletins beautiful except for the last one, the one Thorbad did for himself, said Taxum thoughtfully. But why did he misread the notes from Vanderthil and the healer? Did Feyfolken exchange those words? Perhaps, smiled the great sage. Or did Feyfolken change Thorbad's perception of those words? Asked Vungeldak. Feyfolken make him mad after all? Very likely, said the great sage. But that would mean that Feyfolken was a servitor of Sheogorath, said Vungeldak. And you said he was a servitor of Clavicus Vile. Which was he, an agent of mischief or an agent of insanity? The will was surely altered by Feyfolken, said Taxum, and that's the sort of thing a servitor of Clavicus Vile would do to perpetuate the curse. As an appropriate ending to the tale of the scribe and his cursed quill, smiled the great sage, I will let you read into it as you will. He's like, this story is up to your interpretation. Wow. They're just ending the story there? It's up to us to interpret it how we want. This guy has been sitting next to us the entire time. Grug has been here dissociating for the longest time.